Can I start with the development of intercity services, both provided by Eireann and other service providers, and specifically in relation to long journey times from Dublin down into Limerick and into Cork and beyond. Is there a requirement on those services that there would be, for instance, the provision of toilet facilities on board those coaches, be they publicly owned or privately owned, and is that adhered to? Because if there's a non-stop service for, say, for argument's sake, from Limerick to Dublin, it probably takes about 3 hours. So I presume that there is a basic licence requirement for toilet facilities on board those buses, and what inspection takes place to make sure that's adhered to. Then, just in relation to Eireann, can you give me an indication of the level of profitability in the school bus service? Because I know you were here before and we discussed this issue, and what proportion of the profit, if any, from the school transport service is used for other services within Eireann. As well as that, just in relation to, again, in relation to, I suppose, branding, over the Christmas period here, I've noticed, and a couple of people have noticed, Transport for Ireland advertising now on mainstream broadcast media. You might give me an indication as to why that is, because we have Transport for Ireland with 4 different companies apportioned to it, and it just seems to me a very complicated branding kind of initiative as to what's trying to be achieved and what's being achieved. And can you also indicate how much is that advertising campaign costing, who's paying for it as well? And then just as well, I suppose, to go back to intercity route corridors, and specifically in relation to the private operators who are going through provincial towns that aren't bypassed, and I've raised this issue before, specifically in relation to the extension of licences that are granted from Limerick to Dublin, down into Kerry, through Tralee and Killarney specifically, passing through the towns of Adair, Newcastle West and Abbeyfield, with Rathkeil and Castleisland being bypassed. What progress is being made in relation to extending those services into those provincial towns, and when can we expect to see a service change?
Whoever wants to take that first.
Maybe if I start with the branding issue first. Transport for Ireland. The legislation setting up the NTA required it to develop a uniform brand for public transport in an effort to integrate public transport. And that's what we're doing here. So the legislation setting us up actually requires us to do this. Transport for Ireland is meant to be simply the customer-facing brand that unifies across all the transport modes. So Transport for Ireland website is the place where you get all details of a journey planner, fares, services and so on. And the purpose of doing some advertising on it is to start to get out that message that there is an integration of public transport happening. It's under the umbrella of Transport for Ireland, and that's going to just grow over the years ahead. In terms,
just for the tourists coming into Ireland, and I know the legislative requirement, but for the tourists coming into Ireland, or indeed for the Irish public traveller, between LEAP, CIE, Eireann, Irish Rail, Eireann, Lewis, the NTA, Transport for Ireland, not to mention all the taxi companies that are out there, isn't it time that there be a single name? I mean, if for the person coming into Dublin Airport that's not familiar with it, between Aircoach, the Green Bus, the Dublin Bus, Eireann, and you're here with your phone with Transport for Ireland, you say to yourself, this is a bizarre setup. Whereas if you arrive in Boston or any other city probably in Europe or anywhere else, you have a single branding entity that faces you the minute you arrive at your destination.
I'm not going to disagree with you in the slightest. I think we have a challenge to develop what we started to develop a lot further over the years ahead. But we're dealing with the legacy of things that have been set up decades and decades ago. So it'll take some time to change. But we'd like to get into the space that you've mentioned there. That's the place we'd like to aim for.
Is that actively in progress? Is there an active Like, I mean, if you're talking about integrating Lewis, Dart, Dublin commuter rail, mainline rail, Dublin bus and bus Eireann, surely even something that, like, something as basic as they all being the same colour would be a start. But Irish Rail has rebranded over the last 3 years at a cost. Bus Eireann, as we were just after being told, have rebranded at a cost. We've had a leap card introduced with another new name being foisted upon us at a cost. It just seems every time that there's a will to inject cash into one of the public transport services, a rebranding comes, and it's not in keeping with what you're trying to achieve. In other words, that there should be a single brand entity for Transport Ireland or something like that. And on top of that, you have DART, CIE International Tours, etc., etc., etc.
Okay, well, the space we're focused on is this subsidised service that the state is providing. So certain ones that you mentioned there are commercial services, and we're not able to necessarily bring them under an umbrella, it's the same umbrella. But the objective you set out there is the objective we have ourselves. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time to achieve, but that's the direction we're going in.
And in relation to the other questions I asked about things like from the NTA's requirement for toilet facilities and the extension of the licences from the Limerick routes.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on those two. Deputy, toilets on board are not something that we specify within the licence, not a licence requirement. However, I do believe a number of the providers, including Bus Eireann, actually do provide toilet facilities on certain coaches for longer distance.
You allocate a licence to a bus that potentially travels from Tralee to Dublin non-stop, which could be 4.5 hours, depending on traffic, and there's no requirement for a toilet. It's not going to stop.
There's no licensing requirement for a toilet on board the vehicle.
Is that adequate in 2016, that you could have potentially people stuck on a bus for 4.5 hours with no access to a toilet?
Well, as I said, I believe a number of the providers do, in fact, recognise that as a customer
but is it good enough?
And do provide that.
But is it good enough that a licence is being given out and there's no requirement for a toilet?
Well, in the licence and in the legislation requires us to nominate the starting and the closing points of the journey, to nominate the stopping points along the timetable, and that's the extent of the powers that we have in licensing to provide for that. We don't get into the branding of the vehicle, we don't get into other aspects where you're talking commercial services that are licensed.
No, but this is a licence that's given out by the NTA, and in a lot of cases some vulnerable passengers are going to be on board. A lot of passengers that are potentially going to be on board for provincial locations, for instance, if we come into Dublin for things like hospital appointments. And to be expected to travel from Killarney to Dublin knowing that you can't get off of the bus will not stop to go to the toilet, I don't believe that's acceptable.
Well, I think in the commercial world that's a matter that the operators themselves will provide.
It's a matter for you as a licensing agency, isn't it?
Point is made. So.
Well, I don't think the point is heard, Chairman, with the greatest of respect. I mean, the licensing agency thinks it's appropriate that people should be expected to sit on a bus from Killarney to Dublin in the full knowledge that the bus will not stop and there's no toilet on board.
It's not a licence condition that we impose on operators at the present time.
It takes longer to go from Killarney to Dublin than it does to go from Shannon to New York. And there's no toilet on board, and no requirement to put a toilet on board. I mean, if Aer Lingus and Ryanair operated under that, there'd be an absolute outcry. I would ask, Chairman, that would be reviewed. I know elderly people who have no choice but to get a particular service and who might have any form of a medical condition, whether it is, elderly men or something like that who might have a bladder or a bowel problem. They have no option but to plan their journey well in advance. And I think, to be fair about it, a passenger paying a fare or a passenger being PSO'd by virtue of the Free Travel Initiative should at least have the courtesy of knowing that if they get on board and they need to go to the toilet without having to stop the bus on the side of the motorway, that they can do that.
Could just intercede here for us to be practical or constructive, could it be looked at in future reviews of licence or criteria?
Something we'll look at. We are required to undertake a review of the licensing regime this calendar year anyway, so that is something we will bring into that discussion on the
Just on this point, can I ask Bus Eireann, for people that are travelling on non-stop Bus Eireann services that are in excess of 3 hours, have they access to a toilet?
We have a fleet of toilet coaches came in last year. We used them in the longer services. Most of our services are limited stop. They do stop in places, so there are opportunities for people. So it's not necessarily a problem for us at this stage.
Non-stop services, and
Yeah,
you
we don't go from we go from Killarney, Tralee into Limerick, and from Limerick to Dublin.
But you go from
Ballina to Dublin be our longer service.
You go Cork to Dublin non-stop, don't you?
From
Cork to Dublin non-stop.
our Go BE services do, and they have toilets in them.
Okay, so your non-stop services have toilets.
In general, yeah. In general, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but remember, Ballina to Dublin, it's not a motorway. So they do stop in various places, Longford, many other places along the way. So there are opportunities for people to go to the toilet on all of our services.
But the point I'm making, Mr. Nolan, is if the bus leaving Ballina, if there's a bus leaving Ballina and the driver fills the bus and all the passengers on board are saying we're going to Bus Hours in Dublin, that bus won't stop. If the bus is full, it won't stop.
The bus will stop. It doesn't go directly. Okay, and depending on the road conditions on a motorway, it's easy to use a toilet. When you have roads that are bumpy and that, there's also safety concerns of the speeds of the buses and that as well. So there are opportunities for people to go to the toilet where appropriate on the buses or off the bus.
Okay, and what about?
Could I also, sorry, schools transport?
No, I asked about school transport.
Yeah, very quickly, schools transport.
Just that others are
But no, Chairman, I've waited for all of me. No, I wasn't in and out.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I'm following the procedure that was laid out at the beginning, and we're only holding ourselves up by this. Okay.
Schools transport is a cost recovery operation. There is no profit in schools transport. No cross subsidisation involved. So we say that every time we're here.
Deputy